This is John Spencer, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Yes, indeed. Hey, so everybody who's watching the show right now, by the way, I am finally back from my cross country, coast to coast trip with that Scott Husing and I did for Save the Brave, trying to continue the awareness of veteran suicide and also to raise money to help us fight that fight. So I'm back, first show back in the studio with John Spencer. And I thought it would be interesting, John, for us to have the conversation about the defund the police thing. Now, we've had some police people on the show. Sid Rail was on the show and he talked quite a bit about it. And so that for sure informs. But I think it's interesting to look at, from a more crappy perspective. We've gone abroad, you and I. We've, had the intention as a country, as an organization, personally, to build up the capacity of the police, because we've seen, what happens when the government institutions don't work and what rule of law looks like, in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan. So I thought it would be interesting and in general contribute to the conversation in a way that, like, this is where we could be headed, or this is what we're trying to prevent. So when I give you that intro, what are your thoughts in terms of, from your experience, did you spend any time doing specific police training? I mean, obviously we all worked around it, but did you do any of it specifically?
Absolutely. So in both my tours, I would say, and I tell people all the time, I did about 90% policing and local community security and stability. But in both of my tours, to include, I was in 2003, part of the invasion, and about a week after, hashtag fighting stopped, and we transitioned into stability operations, or even before we transitioned to that, getting local police back up and running, everything from finding police to getting them uniforms, to getting them weapons, to doing training, helping them with their 911 center. We were doing it all in 2003. And when I went back in 2008 and deployed into Baghdad, I mean, orders of magnitude more complex, but every day I was with the local police, the traffic police, the highway. I mean, most people don't understand how much the military interacts with local police or, works to help improve crime, because there's some stark differences. So especially on the intro that, you and I both get criticism on comparing stuff in the United States to military actions abroad, which rightfully so. There's giant comparisons, but like you said, there is also the firsthand experience of, seeing a world where many of the things that we take for granted, in our culture, just our cultural norms towards each other, our rule of law, the things that are the backbone of our society that even some of the people that are protesting either don't acknowledge, don't recognize, or take for granted.
Yeah, there's a real conversation to be had here, and I agree with you. Similarly, and this is just for the audience or anything else. When I would come in as an outsider to a unit, I'm looking at what the commander is trying to accomplish, and there are basically four things, right? And then I know you'll appreciate this. It's close with and destroy the enemy, if at all possible, because these are all line units. These are artillery units. These are units that can hold battleground when the area is not permissible. We'll talk about permissibility in a minute. The other thing they try to do is protect the force. That's like the second line of their 4-line statement. And then they're going to teach, train, and advise, whatever verbs they're using, the local governance, whether it's the government, the police, the military, and then finally, enable the enablers, the people that help them accomplish the line above. That's the basic mission statement of any commander. And so if you take that and apply that to, say, the mayor of a town, it's immediately the same thing. I mean, obviously, you're not trying to close with and destroy the enemy, but you are trying to maintain stability. You are trying to protect the population. You are trying to continue to improve government services throughout that is the mayor's mission exactly, to a T. So though it's a combat lens, I think I know it applies directly, and I help the commander do that quite a bit. One of the things that we also struggle with is our intention versus our output. And boy, you know, we all are well intended. Did you get a chance to work with any embedded Leos as well?
Absolutely. So we
Yeah.
had at our battalion level, not at my company level, we had a Leo who was really at that point of the war, and we're talking especially at 2009, 2010, kind of counterpart to detective crime scene analysis, some of the higher level policing,
Right.
where I was at more at the community level. But yeah, definitely. And Leos are, most people don't understand how big of a program that is, because policing, so the human need of security, if you look at kind of what you need to have a civilization, to have a community, I spend most of my time understanding cities, or how to, like you said, I mean, I love the breakdown you just gave, but how to achieve a mission in a city. But you got to put security at number one, and then go through the other human needs of potable water, and then at the very bottom I put internet. Some people don't agree with that, but you know, just the ability, and I think this is one of those things that people take for granted. I have 3 small children, but there's this human basic need of security and the feeling of security, not just the what we think of security, but the feeling of security, to know that you can walk the streets and not be a target of violent crime, or some other rule of law will be established. And I talk about this a lot, and you and I both have been in communities, parts of urban areas where somebody else is controlling it. It isn't a legitimate force, but somebody will control it, and their rule of law. You talk about the Taliban, you talk about the bad people that we kind of know about, they'll go in and instill rule of law, and it won't be the kind of human, democratic ideals that we have of power enforcement. But no matter what, the power will find a way. It just might not meet what we should view as a global ideal state of a feeling of security.
Let's come back to the power part, because that's a big thing. And then what I want to do now is expand on that conversation of security, because I was talking to a district governor in Afghanistan, and this is the guy that I learned most of my things from. I had to build up to the point where I could allow this to happen, by the way. So this isn't just magical Pete sat down. I had made all the mistakes. I'd watch us as an organization make all the mistakes. And so I knew to shut up and get out of the way and let this person teach me what needed to be taught, even if it was like an indirect kind of education. And he said, first off, he said, female education is my number one priority. Okay, great. He's like, however, already a caveat, security is number one. And boys' education is number one. These things have to come first. So you don't get your first priority in a non-permissible environment. You have to work on these other things that have to come in order. And that doesn't mean that boys are before girls, but he's like, these men have to know how to go out of the house and go run families, because that's where we are at right now, right? The security part was there are 3 facets to it, and they're all individual. So the Afghan male needed to know that they could project themselves away from their family and conduct their business and come back and return safely. If they didn't believe that, they couldn't leave the house. So the next element is when I leave the house, is my homestead protected? Is it safe? Are there some kind of security asset that's going to protect that? If not, I can't leave the house, because now my job is security. If those other 2 security aspects are met, then I can project my kids to a school. But without all 3 of those things, there is no security. And then I would add a 4th element in, is the perception of security. It doesn't matter how secure, it actually is, how much crime is actually on the streets. It's what they believe. And so we would do all this incredible training with the police forces to create, capacity similar to American capacity. But if no one knows that you're Afghan police force, Iraqi police force, Egyptian, whatever, we partner with all kinds of countries. If no one else knows that they know how to do IVs and hand-to-hand combat and run a crime lab, then it doesn't exist,
Yeah. I think that's another one of those underwriting tones. What you're talking about is trust. So it's both a real thing. Like I have to trust that when I leave the house, my world is secure, or when I'm leaving, I have to trust that it's safe, or I have to trust that if something happens, there are it isn't only up to me to help myself. And
Right.
that's everything down to the community, as in a neighbor's going to come to my rescue, or I can call somebody and somebody's going to come. But trust in those people as well. And I think I'm sure we'll talk about that. And even in Iraq, you and I, or in Afghanistan, know that a legitimate government or a legitimate security apparatus is only as good as the trust that it can build. If not, the people or whoever it is you're trying to help will trust somebody else.
This is a great point, because I have to take a picture real quick. This is a great point because it brings us back to the U.S. side of things. So again, if our mayor has the same kind of goals and they have this competent police force, and if, I don't know, let's say that we know that you can't have 100% perfect police patrols because we don't budget for it and it's just not possible.
No.
So if your police patrols are 98% of the time getting the desired outcome, which is whatever it is, maintaining the peace and everything, then you're doing a pretty good job. But when something tragic happens, something criminal happens from your police force, it erodes from the trust in the community, right? So now we have this problem where people want to defund the police. And to be fair, and then this applies again to the combat soldier. I mean, you're a ranger. You've worked in the Ranger Regiment. You're built to do certain jobs. And now all of a sudden you're going to be a combat advisor. You're going to be given an interpreter and never given a real professional level class on how to work an interpreter. You're going to be marshaling projects, because the CA team is depleted, and you know what it's like. There are too many jobs, and the police are no different. I mean, how many variables do they have to account for? So this is for the audience. In the military, in the Army especially, we have a thing called a METL, a mission essential task list that you train to. And these are mission essential. Like, they're not playing around. Like, you have to have these tasks and develop a mastery in them. But the METL is so long that you could never develop any kind of real capacity in most things. Like, just in training, packing up the truck and going and leaving and getting on a railhead is it takes forever to do these things. So we're asking our police to do something that's significant. So I understand the defund idea, like, let's get some social workers, but let's bring in permissibility and trust into that. Like, if you need a first government responder, right? I mean, and let's understand that first responders is self-response. It's family response. It's bystander response. But when that first representative of the government comes, John, can it not be the police? Can it be a social worker? Can they be standing by in social worker cars patrolling around? And I'm not trying to make light of this. I'm trying to take it seriously. But, can this be something where the cop says this requires a social aspect? And again, okay, so let me use a combat example. And I'm talking way too much, but you and I go on a combat patrol. We find IED. We now own that IED. Now on TV, the EOD guys show up, the bomb squad. They show up in minutes. But in reality, it's 6 hours. Your mission for the day is done because this bomb is there, right? So how do we get past it? So should it be a cop that marshals these things, or could there be some less lethal, less freedom denying force that could patrol? And then at some point, these guys have to be on the street. So what are your thoughts on all of that?
Man, it's a lot. First off, don't get me in trouble because my wife's EOD. So
yeah,
so say that,
those guys are awesome. It just takes a long time.
It does, and it got better. For my 2003 deployment, exactly. If I found something, I was going to sit on it for a very, very long time. By 2008, 2009, depending on the mission, I'd have EOD embedded with me, so that made it instantaneous. But of course, we were finding really bad bombs every block or so, depending on the mission.
Yeah,
I mean, I think your point, and as advising a bunch of commanders, I probably got this so wrong, even in my deployments. This METL task that we have, or these things that you wanted us to do in Iraq, or we want our police doing, or we want our emergency management services doing. And we give them this list of tasks, and then, but there's ultimately an end state that we want, right? We want a safer street. We want that community ability to walk the streets safely, no matter what time of day or night, into whatever area. Now, how we get there is the argument. And even in combat, it becomes, what do you measure as well?
Mm-hmm.
So like you said, the projects, I invested, hundreds of thousands of dollars into playgrounds in my neighborhoods in Iraq, whether they asked for it or not, because we wanted to improve community life. We had good intentions. And I think that's one of the things that most people take for granted as well, is that everybody that on both sides have good intentions, and they're rational human beings that are trying to do good. Is when somebody assumes that that's not true, there's a breakdown and a real issue. So if you look at like the defund the police argument, of course we see the huge positives to investing in social programs, but the number one thing you want your police doing is reducing violent crimes, in my opinion.
Permissibility of the environment, right? Can people conduct their lives in a way that makes some damn sense? Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And especially, I mean, the question about, can a social service person be the responder? Your context matters. And that's one of the problems that I think we had in Baghdad. And as I see militaries and governments and rioters in cities, is that they just don't understand the context. One thing that applies to one city isn't applicable to another. There's so many human aspects to community life that have to be studied and understood to have the conversation, because if not, huge mistakes are made in investments that don't apply to that area, or huge changes without data that shows that it's going to make whatever it is we're trying to do better. And that's my problem, I think, in my experiences in combat, is the data that was driving so many major decisions. Or was it just good intentions, but the data would show you that what you were doing, it was actually counterproductive? Everything from microeconomics, which is very complex in city, to policing. If I'm just throwing money into new police vehicles, that may not get me to the objective of a better security environment, a reduction of violent crimes, where something else might. It's so hard. And I think that's the problem with these conversations, Pete. And you and I kind of get this, is obtaining the level of understanding you need is the problem.
It is the problem. Let me ask you this. I don't know how many deployments you had in Baghdad and Afghanistan where you had, specific missions like this, but did you make a positive difference in your head at the time? Were you doing like exemplary work?
Absolutely.
And then looking back, reflecting, did you accomplish anything?
Absolutely. Yes to both. This gets you into that military talk problem with tactics versus strategy. We were deployed into both a non-permissible environment where there was no government that could help you in accomplishing whatever the mission that you had set forth, which was it obtainable or not in 2003, regime change, disestablishment of all security forces, but made everything else stable. I 100% think that we made an impact at the local level.
Yeah.
I think at the national level, as a country in which U.S. forces helped in, if it falls apart the day you leave, did you accomplish your mission, which was creating sustainable governance, sustainable security? That's questionable. I think that, and that goes back to everybody involved has great intentions.
Yeah.
And sometimes you give people missions that just aren't attainable. In Afghanistan, and I want to extend the national governments out to the hinterlands. That's just not, it's never been like that, never going to be like that. It's just
not in this deployment, at least.
No, not in this century. I don't know.
Let me now provide a little bit of insight on that, because I got to stay and watch unit after unit come through, and every unit should think they did exemplary work. They trained hard, but it didn't train right enough, and we didn't accomplish nearly as much as we thought. So I would watch the next unit come in, and literally throw the legacy of the last unit out the door and start over again. And so we had this maddening thing. And the reason why I bring this up, this is partly for the audience. The reason why I bring this up is because everybody I'm going to ask is going to tell you that they did a great job because we really wanted to. We tried really hard. We poured our heart and soul into it, and we could measure our success. But when I go into town and I'm like, hey, Colonel Spencer, I was talking to a bunch of the locals, and I was asking them this basic question. I was saying, hey, if a bad man is in the neighborhood, what are you going to do? And I'm like, well, I'm going to go in my house, or I'm going to kill him, whatever it is. I'm like, okay, let's say that you shouldn't kill them. Who do you call for help? Well, there's no phones around here, so I can't call anybody. So I'll knock on my neighbor's door. My neighbor's my cousin. Okay, your neighbor is like, I'm not going to go out and fight those guys. Who do you call? Who do you call? Who do you call? And I kept asking, who do you go to? And then I had to prompt them and say, what about the police? And then, Colonel Spencer, they laughed in my face. And this is year, I don't know, 10 in the process. And when I bring that news to you, and then again, keep this in mind, we're connecting this back to Berkeley, California, Jacksonville, Florida, anywhere you want in between. You want to create these outcomes, but when I go into town and I can't find it, and that's with the regular police now, I go to the right community, in whatever, some part of Cleveland where it's primarily Black or Hispanic or Polish or whatever it's going to be. And I say, are the police going to take care of you? I'm going to tell you right now, the answer is no. Right. So when I tell Colonel Spencer that you guys are working your hearts out, trying to train these things, you have Leos and millions of dollars of assets, and I can't find anyone that'll call the police. Matter of fact, they laugh in my face. What does that say to you as a commander? What are you going to do?
So it probably would have made me mad had you done it when I was there because of reflection. Absolutely true. And like you said, you ask anybody who's deployed or on the streets of their opinion of, are they making it? And of course their answer is going to be yes. But what the problem comes in is the measures. Right. And can we agree on the measures, or are the measures really making decisions? As if you ask any commander in any environment, especially in war, he's going to say, I'm doing what I'm told to do. Yeah. And we have to tie it back to all the political objectives.
And that's part of the reason why I made you a colonel and in charge of a battalion or a brigade. Yeah. Because that doesn't work for that guy,
Yeah. But I mean, so it's all on the, like you said, the data. So you're using survey-based data on the community. And my reflections of, especially being in Baghdad, is my Western opinion of what policing should look like wasn't their ideal of policing, nor would it ever be. To include the police who you try to partner with and say, okay, we've learned from the history of policing that it has to be community-based. You have to understand your community. You have to be in your community. The community has to trust you as a policeman, as a protector. That's not the belief that they have. Their belief is not community-based policing. It's responsive community policing, as in something happens and a policeman comes, and if they catch a violent person, they may arrest him. But their ideas of policing are not what ours are today. And that might have changed my measures of effectiveness or measures of priority of what I was doing. Of course, as a ranger, as an infantryman in Baghdad, my number one priority was the targeting and removal of violent extremists, terrorists off the streets. And there were plenty. And meanwhile, I'm trying to improve community policing. I mean, here in the United States, one of our measures of effectiveness of policing is how fast will a policeman show up to my doorstep if a violent or a tier 1 call, violent crime, rape, murder, you name it, which is very little of what police do in the statistics.
For sure.
But the measure is, in that worst case scenario, how fast can I trust in my investments, my taxes, everything, that somebody's going to show up to my door? Is it 8 minutes? Is it 12? Is it half an hour?
Yeah.
In our society, in views of policing, we want immediate help.
Yeah.
And that's to me the problem with not data-driven change. We all agree on what we think the problems are, but we don't agree on how to get there. And we're either misapplying examples. Let's say Camden, New Jersey, of the disbanding of the police, although that's not really what happened, and applying it to a mega urban environment and saying, that's what should happen here. That misuse of what the measure is and the data we try to use to say we need change and this is what the change should be is a problem in war as much as it is in the conversations we're having across the nation today.
It's a big, multivariate, hard, complex problem, Steve. We could have already taken 10 different avenues on this conversation by itself. So given that these are really complex things and we're trying to sort out, and our experience in doing this and watching it, would you say, is it better to take the system you have, and make an adjustment to policy? Like, I don't know, banning the carotid choke, which I don't know if that's the right thing, but just use that as a thing we could do. Say, we don't want people dying unnecessarily, even if they are a violent criminal. Our job is to, make the area secure, not kill less people, or to kill less people. Or is it, do you wholesale do a giant reform and a defund or a refund in terms of we're going to reuse this money or other assets? Is it, because you and I both know, like, it's not dollar for dollar exchange. If you have a $10 billion police thing and you cut that, $10 billion won't go to the other thing. You've got police forces. You've got to account for where those guys go. They have a union to protect them. There's all kinds of expenses. So you're going to lose a large portion of that money that you move over. So is it better to make continued change? And then also, let's understand this: training is expensive, and I don't see anybody in the I don't see anybody in that let's charge more tax and create more capacity and have a third bigger police force so that we could constantly have people healing and training. I don't see anybody in the higher taxes line. So what do you think? Is this a problem for complete reform, wholesale change, or is it better to take small incremental steps that we can measure and try to grow to?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Give me a softball, Pete. Why don't you? That's so. The problem with the question is, where are we talking about? Every place is going to be different. So once we narrow down to the location, let's say Portland, Oregon, or somewhere where right now there's a major spike in protests or community outcries, and say we want change. And I've written about this recently. Like, okay, great, we all want change. Let's agree as a social community what the changes we think need to happen. And why? And what's the problem? Well, one is, what's the problem? Is the problem police brutality? Is it social inequality? Is it racial targeting of police practices? And once we agree on what the problem is, then we elect people to come together and we have a community process to say, this is what we think is leading to that problem. Yeah.
Can I add something to this?
Yeah, go ahead.
And is this problem an executive problem?
Yeah.
Is the mayor not guiding his police chief or her police chief in a way that is good for the community? I mean, that's another, the police chief is going to do what the mayor says. I mean, that's who directs that asset. Absolutely.
But there is, some of this problem may be, again, context always matters. It may be a giant organization who's just gone unchecked for a while. Now, does unchecked mean had bad intentions? No. I mean, we have, like you said, incremental change. We have these, city councils, election processes, priority of community investments. It's a process on purpose so that we frequently check in on it. Could the problem be, a reduction of a police force? Or could it be a reduction of training hours? Or could it be an overtaxed police force with the number of shifts they're doing? There's so many variables there that have to be understood at the local level. And you and I know that this becomes the ultimate problem, is understanding what the problem is and how you're trying to achieve it. And any type of rotational, leadership switching out, um, creates more of a problem than actually finding the solution. Um, I'm a big believer in data-driven problem solving. And that's just something that the military teaches us, but I've learned it even more so now being out of the military and trying to understand cities, everything from security, like what is the measure that the community is using to measure its police? Is it, the reported uses of inappropriate use of force? Is it the crime rate? Is it the response rate? All these things. And to answer your question, Pete, I'd have to know what the problem is to understand, is it an adjustment to policy? Training, I'm not a believer in elimination of tactics. So I'm not a believer in eliminating the chokehold just because I think that's a band-aid to what you think your problem is, which is the misappropriation of force. I can hurt somebody just as good with other tactics than a chokehold. I mean, let's be honest. So is it, more training, more, peer influence? That's so huge in the military and in the police, is that you're rarely alone. And is it the person next to you? It's not an innocent bystander. That's a check. That's part of the checks and balances, is that there's somebody else there. There's somebody else that shows up. And that's what we saw, especially in the George Floyd case. To me, the biggest problem was that inability of peers to influence each other on a full recognition that something's not right here.
Right.
So it's a long answer. I agree. Training is expensive, but leader development is also, in the military or any big organization, probably the biggest investment you should be making, especially when your profession relies on trust so much. I also think there's an information campaign here that doesn't get addressed as much as it should. When, what most people believe, or what a lot of people believe, is based on what they get out of campaigns of reporting. Not saying, fake news or anything like that, but if you need an understanding of a community, you need all sides of that. There is no such thing as unbiased reporting, but how do you, if you're standing there and you're furious, where have you gotten your information on what happened, what's really going on in this community, those type of things? And that's a big investment in the military, in order to be seen as legitimate power. But I think we as a community, as a nation, have underinvested in that information part of it. I deal with a lot of law enforcement like you do, and they're up in arms that nobody's telling the 99.5% of the good stories that's happening every day, and the people that are lives are saved. All this, people are only getting the daily 0.0005 something went wrong. Somebody, there are bad apples in every organization, that kind of information. So if I was a city, I would be investing in information sharing across my community, both good and bad.
This is a good point. The information problem is enormous. And again, this is not just fake news. It's easy to say that, but that's just brain dead. There's a lot of information problems. Again, like, how good is the police, and what's good? Like, what is good? So is a 99.5% successful? I mean, there are hundreds of millions of police patrols where there's no violence, hundreds of millions every year. So the system is tremendously successful. I think you could put our police force person for person against any nation, and we will do just fine in terms of how we handle situations. You can't even have a good police force in half of the nations, We know that if you are in trouble and you call the police, they will send someone. Now, is it perfect across the entire nation? Of course not. But for the most part, the vast majority of us know that. One of the problems is that when you inject race, and this is Pete saying this, I'm not going to make you say anything, but when we inject race into a big social problem, it rots out the logic. And it doesn't mean that there aren't racial problems. It brings so much emotion and so much charge in that you can't say something like, hey, is this a poor people problem or is this a black people problem? There aren't rich people getting shot by the cops. Like, that's just not the thing. There are poor people that are getting shot because they have more trap doors underneath them. They get closer to F it. I'm trying to swear less on the show. They get closer to F it a lot faster because they have a lot less to lose. I mean, if we solved and today's episode that I'm going to put up for the podcast is Bjorn Lomborg, and he's an environmentalist, and he's, like, let's put our money where it's the most valuable. And by the way, global warming, whatever you want to call it, climate change is going to be a lot more harmful to people that don't have money than people that do have money. So how do we get more people more money? And if you look at these problems like that, that's a different way of solving the problem. It's like, yeah, there's problems and there's an environmental, we need to do better at these things. Where should we invest our money? And in a police force, to think that, and look, you've gone on patrols, right? So you get the briefing. Look for the white Brazili Iraqi taxi cab with the guy with the mustache who's wearing sandals. His name is Mohammed. He's very dangerous. Well, holy shit. There's 1,000 of those dudes. So if you're a cop in Minneapolis driving around looking for someone who's described as black, and you don't know if the car really is blue or not. How many times you use the car described as something nondescript? You're like, that could be any car on the road. When you pull that next person over, anybody is going to be like, okay, I'm on alert. I am triggered because my life is in jeopardy. You and I, we can harden ourselves to that. But I also know that you and I have like certain gates. And if you get past this gate, it's now me or you, whether you realize that or not. I'm going to elevate faster than you will. I'm going to take decisive action, whether it's lethal or not. And I think police are going to be in the same zone because they're out there every day. And if I got PTSD from going to combat a whole lot, how in the world can those guys not get it? So what are your thoughts on how we deal with the public perception of what reality is for what police officers actually do? And then how dangerous that job actually is. We're talking about these peaceful protests, and there's dozens of cops in hospitals with broken bones and things. That's not peaceful. That's violent. It's criminal. So, and look, I have to say this because I have no problem with peaceful protests, but when there's dozens of cops, like the DC City Police, my friend, he's one of these, like, there are over 50 of us that during these peaceful protests were injured on the job. So how do we deal with the actual day-to-day thing? If I put you in a room with simunitions and I'm talking to the audience and I said, go sort out this impossible situation in real time right now, you can call whoever you want for backup, but right now it's you and that person. That ain't easy work.
Yeah. Yes. There's a lot there, Pete. The most important of what you just said, and I agree, is that peaceful protest, or the right to protest, is within our society a right that is protected, a freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to do peaceful protest. But the minute an individual decides to, even beforehand, that it's going to be violent, they are criminals in accordance with our society and should be jailed for that. And my heart goes out to across our nation, the law enforcement who get the mission to stand ground at a certain location to try to protect public order and protect the people that aren't out there trying to be violent. Just because I've had experience in riots and crowd control, it is probably the most stressful thing I've ever done in combat. So, but anybody who goes violent during these protests, to me, based on my opinion, should be jailed and severely punished for taking something that's an American right to protest and to demand change. And as soon as you turned it violent, or you went into it with violent, and I agree with some of the media, if you're bringing a Molotov cocktail or a blinding laser to a protest, you had the intentions of violence and you should be arrested for that. Now back to racial profiling, discrimination within the police force could very well be a problem that needs to be addressed. But the problem, I would say, in all these communities is demand information. So the government has ownership of some of the information that none of us have on, within the last year, how many calls for service, what they call it, had the police responded to. Yeah. So is the community taxing the emergency management services for potholes, which is
Right.
crazy. The number of people call police because they found a pothole they want addressed. But I think all of our local communities should be better at police. So just for context, I just interviewed our city's police chief for my podcast for their warfare project, just because I felt that, people in general don't understand how it works. And I didn't understand, even, given the mission that we talked about, I had in Iraq and Baghdad, some things that police experts know should be prioritized and are important that I was just not even thinking about. So that type of basic information our communities don't have. And some of that ownership is on the government to provide it. Like, I mean, how many violent crimes did we stop or, within the last year or so, or last month? And then, this is because it's my job to understand this stuff. Is our problem the police, or is it some other social thing where unemployment has been proven in the United States to be a high driver of crime rates?
Right.
So if a major city has lost all kinds of major manufacturing and has the level of unemployment has skyrocketed, it has to be addressed. If not, it leads to further problems.
Yeah.
And actually, the reduction of crime in some of the major cities in the United States had nothing to do with changes to policy and crime policing, but were actually changes or economic solutions. And that's the social reform that some people in the defund the police want. But that's an understanding of how the budget is being allocated today. Yeah, I agree. All those things need more money. Does that mean I want less police on patrol? Absolutely not, because I don't want my call for a tier 1 crime going from 8 minutes to 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Do I think they need again, it's all context. That amount of information, the budget details would drive a decision like what we're making now. So you have city councils all across America just making blanket $20 million from the police.
Yes.
Like what? Well,
yeah.
What was that $20 million? Was it for?
Yeah.
And all of these things are important. Some areas it's not. Some areas don't have a problem. Yeah. You got protests, and let's look at the data. You don't have a problem.
Well, if you just look at some of the numbers, and this is just some of the numbers, but if a bullet enters a body, from like civilian to civilian, that's going to be $750,000. So if you cut $20 million from the budget and shootings go up by any percentage at all over the course of a year, you didn't save any money. You didn't save a damn cent. I don't care if it's $250,000. If shootings go up by 10%, you're done. You're done. You've lost $20 million in addition to it. So these problems require a lot more reflection, And the other thing that I'm curious, you're a combat guy, I'm a combat guy. I'm thinking about where the police officer's hands are, and I'm thinking about where my hands are, so they know that I'm not a threat. Now, look, I'm not committing any kind of big crimes. Am I speeding? Okay, great. Did I run a red light? Yeah, I probably did. Whatever. But I don't want that person to be worried about going home. And I've said this a lot on the show. So, 2 hands on the wheel. I don't move an inch. If they want me to move my hand, I put my fingers into an okay symbol so that I'm like, look, I cannot hurt you with my fingers in this position. So I'm going to go slow. If I've got to grab something with these 2 crappy grabbing fingers, that's what I'm going to do. And until that person's like, if they have their hand on their gun, I'm going to be like super slow, super gentle, not a threat. But that is not the norm because most people aren't combat guys. They don't know to look at hands, and I'm not going to be jumpy. And people get nervous. That cop now has to deal with someone who is acting in a way that would make me go, whoa, hold on. If I was the cop, so what does the community owe itself? I mean, if we want to have better police, that in turn also means we need to be a better community as well. And this kind of goes to what you were talking about earlier with like the response, community response. Resilience is essential. So talk a little bit about your thoughts on that with your experience in combat zones.
Yeah. Some of it's empathy, I think. And this is, again, about understanding the people we're talking about. Do you understand us? For us, it's a soldier's day-to-day job, or do you understand a policeman's day-to-day job and understand how he might be on edge based on interactions with mentally unstable, the worst of our society,
right.
on a frequent basis. And like you said, can you do things yourself to de-escalate that? Some of it's understanding how it all works.
Yeah.
I 100% agree with you. Now, community-based policing or community-based security is something that is also a part of our society. I think is part of any society. And what I was talking about is so I got a knock on my door last night, actually, ironically, because there was a little girl walking the streets, and somebody in my neighborhood knew I had little girls, and they didn't know who this little girl belonged to, because our neighborhood has that kind of community aspect in it. That is huge in any society in the world. Do you have that level of communityness, or you have togetherness? And is there things you can do to build that? I don't know if that's an investment. It's cultural. It's also very contextual on where you live versus I lock my doors because I know that once I enter this community, it's not all good. That is something that I think a lot of research has shown can be worked on. I agree with you. It's understanding, and again, going back to violence is never an answer to demand change. In my view.
Well, yeah, when you talk about this being a cultural problem, one of the things that helps cultural problems get dealt with are in terms of community. Like I would advise commanders, like if you're going to release prisoners, let's bring some sheikhs in so that they're part of the process. So they can say, no, guys are getting out. I've seen them. I saw 15 guys named Mohammed get out of jail 2 days ago. If you're a police chief here in the States and you're going to train on active shooters in the school, I encourage every police chief to invite someone from the community. Be my personal guest. Yes, take a day off from work. Yes, let me feed you lunch, but watch what we're doing so that you have some advocacy within the community. When you look culturally, and I've got this little chart thing that I do, it's a matrix. If you don't know the decision-making process, and if you don't understand the goals of the partner that you're trying to work with, and vice versa, you get outcomes. The most common ones are, and it depends on the quadrant you're in, but incompetence, passive aggressive behavior, or corruption. And if those values are coming back at you as a leader, you need to say, I've got a cultural problem. What do I understand why poor people make the decisions that they do? Probably not. I probably could work on my develop empathy by going, let me find this out. Why are these, you talk about like if you lose jobs, well, when you lose jobs, it also it correlates well to drug use and drug abuse and drug deaths, because they're hopeless. They're like, why not get high? This hurts. This sucks. And so when you develop empathy, whether you're the police or the elder at the black church, the Baptist church in town, if you can develop empathy for the police's situation or the community situation, you've got a chance. But to develop that, you've got to go do something uncomfortable, which means you got to go hang out with the police. Either hang out with them on their turf, or you're hanging out, or they're hanging out on your turf. And that interaction, because you can't fix a cultural problem by not understanding the decision-making process and the goals of that cultural pocket, whether it's one person or 5,000 people. You have to understand those things to get to a point where you can collaborate. Because if you're not going to collaborate, then there's no point in spending money solving the problem, because you're not going to solve it.
Agree. And it goes back, you just using the words understand more. We both are, and how important that is. I agree, but the leader has to respond to a lack of understanding.
Yeah.
So that's why I don't agree with communities responding to protests by immediately defunding, and that hasn't increased understanding on either side. Now you're basically just telling everybody who is trying to do something right that they were wrong, and we're going to take all your money away. So you're telling not just the police, but police involved, civil work, civilian workers, everybody in that organization, that you were doing it wrong, and we're making an immediate change. To me, it's about the information and understanding, whether it's what the goal is for an organization, and let's talk about it. Do we as a community, in different communities, I actually didn't know this, do it differently on how the role of the police in the community. whether it spans to what they respond to, where the fire department here in Colorado Springs, the fire department is, well, not in Colorado Springs, but in some places are involved more in helping with the homeless than it being a program under your police rather than a social program. But all this, I can't say it enough about how important it is for us to understand both sides, and with information and with data, not just somebody up on a news thing talking every day. Show me we're all rational people. We hopefully, not everybody, but most people are rational people. And
most people are rational.
Yeah. And we have a democratic process. We elect these people even down to our community levels to make decisions for us. But that doesn't mean we should give up responsibility to understand, to make those decisions. Like you said, who's making the decision? I'm at fault even both in when I was deployed in combat and here in my local town. Is I just don't know. Maybe I believe it's okay, so I'm not investing my time to understand it. But I don't know how my taxes are being used. I don't know the city budget allocation. That's on me. I should know more, and the information should be readily available as well. And maybe again, this is all a problem, and kind of the world that you and I both live in is helping people understand what seems to be complex problems, but it's not always. Some of it's just inaction or not using the information that's right in front of our face to better either have an opinion, which we all have, or make a decision, because decision makers listen to this stuff just as much as people just trying to make an opinion. And
do you have an informed opinion?
Yes.
Have you, if you want to defund the police, understand the condition of the police first, because when you make a wholesale change, and maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. Maybe you'd have to reset so hard that the new growth is possible. That absolutely can be a thing. But who's responsible when that decision is wrong? When violence goes up for the next 10 years because of this change you brought about. And I guarantee you there's someone in the room like, why don't we spend time doing this other thing, that's less dramatic of a change, but might, also be, and then understand again, what is success? I'm not saying that there's not a problem with race in the nation. I'm not saying there's not a problem with other things, but what does success look like? Is success having less court cases for criminal activity? Is success having less people incarcerated? And like, if you're a non-violent criminal, do you need to be incarcerated? Because I don't know of jails that are closing because there's no customers. I don't know of courthouses being shut down because there's no cases. All we ever do is build bigger and better systems of government. And that seems to me that, look, from the Prison Chronicles, this is what I've learned. The prison system craves young Black men. That's how it survives. That's how it grows. It chews them up, spits them out. And all of us look down upon the people that are chewed up and spit up by the system. That's as effed up as something can be. And it is young Black men in this case, because that's how you get more prisons. That's how you get better court systems. So we do have these problems of these systems, but just wholesale changing something is not an effective way, a reliable way to get success. Maybe that's right for this place, probably not right for that place. If there's so much corruption in the police force that you have to fire everybody, okay. But understand that there's going to be a lot of cost to that, personal, financial, everything.
Yeah. So as you were talking, so it's like recommending a shock to the system as your plan. And the problem is there's no plan. And you've lived this in military advising and military role, is that, we all have a goal. We're going to make a plan to get to that goal, but we should have these decision points along the way that if it's not going as we planned, here are the points where we'll make more and more change. So doing this giant shock to the system, I'm going to cut you $20 million. I'm going to completely disband you. Yeah. That's not a plan in any rational person's mind, as in trying to get to the goal that we all want to get.
Yes.
So is it reversible? So I know this from military. I've just learned the amount of investment you need to create a police force, the amount of time it will take you, with a standardized police academy and everybody who's got inputs on the training and how much training they get, is your shock to the system reversible if it goes very badly?
Right.
Because that's the risk you take. And all these, in every decision, as you know, it's risk. How much risk are you willing to assume to fix something? So I'm not saying there haven't been cases of where shocks to the system have helped, but I just can't think of many that actually led to an improvement that was reversible if it didn't go the way somebody thought it was going to be. So I'm totally against a shock to the system if you don't show me a plan that's measurable and reversible.
Yeah.
So when the violent crime rates in an area jumps up, I don't want just to be able to tell you to say I told you so, or any other measure that we say is a measure that's important to us. If it goes wrong and you can't reverse it, shame on you.
I saw a story the other day. We're almost done here, so I thought I'd bring something slightly different in. I saw a story the other day where some rioters, and this is a story, it's a picture, so who knows? But the picture depicted protesters in the street with handguns stopping a civilian car. That threat of violence is significant. And if you do that to the wrong person, you may have a shootout. And it's only a matter of time before we have another one of those kind of situations where there is a shootout. Because I'll tell you right now, as a combat guy, and I hope I'm never in a situation where I have to ever even consider lethal force. But if you're offering violence, I believe you. And I'm going to act to protect myself and the people around me. So if you bring a gun to a protest, and look, standing there and enforcing your rights and having it sling arms or holding it in some way that is, appropriate for holding a weapon is one thing. Walking towards a civilian vehicle with a pistol is a whole different thing. Because I believe you. I believe that you intend to harm me because you have a gun drawn. So what do we do in these situations? You stood there, and I've been told by commander, if they throw rocks and bricks, you cannot respond. Rocks and bricks were okay to crush my head. What do we do with that? When the protesters want to push things to the very edge of absolute violence, and that's dismissing frozen water bottles being thrown and everything else. What do we do about that, man?
Yeah, as we're seeing, it is not an easy topic. I want to see leadership. One, I want to see any person who crosses the line into criminality arrested.
Right.
I don't care what your intention is or what the right you think you have, but once you and I know, just because we have training, that the sense of a deadly environment and you're approaching me with whether it's hostile intentions or not, but with the capability of causing me harm, you're now in the wrong, and it's going to lead to bad things.
Yeah.
But I want to see leadership, and we have seen this in our country's history. When protests turn violent, there are things that can be done that doesn't involve putting people like you and me or policemen or anybody in the way of the violent protester. That only puts that person at harm. The people that we pay to protect us, we want you to stand there and just take a brick to the head. Put in a curfew, put in stronger, start policing up more of the violent extremists and arresting them. And I want to see more leadership in that aspect. And I agree. I thought the taking of private and public land in Seattle was an absolute wrong thing that leadership allowed to happen.
Yeah.
Again, that's not one of our constitutional rights, is to take somebody else's land and say, I'm claiming this as an independent area. But we have an ownership to de-escalate these situations as well, and sticking protectors in the line of violent extreme protesters, I know that there's a lot of similarity to those words, is only going to lead to very bad situations. So I want to see more leadership, because I agree with you. If I'm going to do everything I can to avoid any situation that about me or my family being harmed, but if they are, everybody has a right to self-protection.
Really briefly, and I know we'll probably bust through our time a little bit here, but that's all right. You and I have both been to places where there are people that do horrendous things to each other. When you trade power away from our current rule of law system to some kind of more tribal based or less government based, you will have warlords. Have you ever met a warlord that didn't have a lot of blood on his hands? Does anybody gather power without a lot of violence from your experience in conflict zones?
No, not like you said. I've met a lot of I've written about this, gang leaders and warlords and community power forces that they're how they keep power and maintain it is through force. It isn't through community or these other forms of power, reverent power. They're not legit. That's why we stood up communities in the millennia. It's the whole tragedy of the commons stuff. Without these practices, then the strong and the violent will impose power, and that's across the world. We see that. No, the answer is no. I've never seen it. I've seen a couple religious leaders with immense power, but when you talk about local enforcement, it is usually through force, and it won't be in the community perspective. It will be force used to maintain power, and pretty straightforward. And that's why we build legitimate or institutions like a trusted profession of policemen that needs to be checked. It needs oversight. It needs leadership. But in the absence of a professional, trusted organization under the rule of law with all kinds of agreed upon codes of conduct, and if without that, that power vacuum is quickly filled by people that use force to maintain the laws that they want to maintain.
And all of that stuff's well and good because everybody in their mind thinks they're going to be the agent of force. But the reality is, the person who's ruthless, who doesn't mind some loss of life to improve their situation, will absolutely act on that. And they will gather that power, and they will, and the police chief in effect is that person. It's just with the government charter, like, we're going to do this as safely as we can. And that person runs for that position, and it is a position of power, and there is blood on their hands. However, for the most part, we trust those people to act as innocuously as they can. But at some point, people get shot in police work. They get abused, and they deal with death and destruction all the time. So it doesn't change. We're not going to have less people dying, less abuse by destroying what is a world leading profession and with our police people. I mean, how many criminal justice people are out there that study this thing passionately to the PhD level? Yep. So
absolutely
not an easy conversation to have, man, but one that we need to continue to have these things, because I don't want us to end up like Afghanistan or Iraq, where nobody trusts anybody unless they have the same last name or same community.
Yeah, I agree with you. I want an informed debate. I want to have the debate. And there are many places in our country that do have problems. But let's have an informed debate about what the problem is and how to get to solutions.
I love it. Hey, man, thanks for coming on the show. I dig it.
Pete.
We're going to do another one in a week or so, hopefully, depending on my camping schedule.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Let's just keep going.
All right. Thanks a lot, Pete. It's always a pleasure. I love the Break It Down show.
Thanks, man. All right. Hold on. Stand by.